Welcome to the 219th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID 19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. Today is a discussion of disinformation in the pandemic with returning COVID calls guest Kate Starbird. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, February 12th, 2021, there are 2,377,988 deaths from COVID 19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 479,842 deaths reported in the United States. In South Korea, they're reporting 1,507 deaths from COVID 19. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is Corky Lee, legendary Asian American photographer, dies at 73. This was published January 28th. 2021 on CNN.com and written by Jesse Young. Corky Lee, an award-winning photographer who captured the everyday lives and political activism of the Asian American community, has died at the age of 73 after battling COVID 19. It is with great sadness that we announce the passing of Corky Young Kwok Lee, said a statement from Lee's family. Corky, as he was known to the Asian American community, was everywhere. He always had a camera around his neck, documenting a community event, capturing a social injustice for the record, and even correcting the social injustice of an historical event that took place well over a century ago. He did what he loved, and we loved him for it. Corky had a very unique lens. His passion was to rediscover, document, and champion through his images the plight of all Americans, but most especially that of Asian and Pacific Islanders. The statement added, "He's left us with what is likely to be the single largest repository of the photographic history of Asian Americans of the past half century." Lee first began experiencing COVID 19 symptoms on January 3rd and was hospitalized on January 7th, according to a family statement on a Facebook fundraiser page. He was moved to the ICU on January 11th. He's survived by his brother and sister-in-law, his elder sister's husband, and both siblings' children, according to the family statement. Corky Lee was born to two Chinese immigrants in Queens, New York. Dubbed the unofficial Asian American photographer laureate, he documented Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in vivid, intimate detail over his 50-year career. His photography began in junior high when he saw a famous 1869 photograph commemorating the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, according to the Asian Pacific American Institute at New York University. But the photo, purportedly showing railroad workers, contained no Chinese workers, despite there being an estimated 15,000 Chinese laborers contributing to its construction. The photo's apparent erasure of Chinese workers inspired Lee's future work, a lifetime of photographing Asian Americans and cementing their representation in history. In one of his most famous works, he gathered a group of Chinese Americans and descendants of Chinese railroad laborers to recreate the 1868 photograph in the same original location. He also captured other historic moments of social and political upheaval. His photos covered anti-war protests, fair housing issues, the gentrification of Chinatown, Islamophobia after 9/11, and more. His work became more widely recognized after 1975, when he captured large-scale protests against police brutality, following the beating of a Chinese American at the hands of New York City police officers. In another well-known instance, Lee photographed furious demonstrations in 1983, sparked by the murder of Vincent Chin and the light sentence for his killers, a turning point for Asian American civil rights in the following decades. Its dedication to documenting racial injustice, its consequences, and the community's resistance continued until the end, with recent work focusing on attacks toward Asian Americans during the coronavirus pandemic, according to the family's statement. His work also depicted the everyday, with many scenes from New York City's Chinatown from the late 20th century. A film about his life and work, Photographic Justice, the Corky Lee story, was in production at the time of his death. When I think about my past, what stands out most is how hard and how long the journey has been, Lee says in the film's trailer. In all my photographs, I'm trying to include as vignettes pages that should be in American history books that have been omitted or taken out. The pursuit of photographic justice, you have to keep going on because there's so much that needs to be done, he adds. Lee's death was met with a Justice posted on Facebook that Lee was a true hero. Our film will pay tribute to his legacy and his never-ending pursuit of photographic justice. Rest in peace, Corky, you're loved and will be forever missed, she wrote. Wong, the curator who appeared in the documentary, said in an Instagram post that he was devastated by the news. I don't know who we'd be without Corky Lee's photos, he wrote. When I was gathering art and archives of Asian American organizing, his photos were evidence of the struggle, a vital report from the movement. Community is made of people who show up, and he showed up to everything. Rallies, exhibitions, dances, policy meetings, and every banquet in Chinatown. Photos have been crucial in preserving history. Immigrants, including Asian American Pacific Islanders, have greatly contributed to the rich fabric of American society, said Linda Ng, national president of the Organization of Chinese Americans. In our fight for the AAPI representation at all tables, we must make sure that also includes representation in history. Corky Lee was an incredible pioneer of these efforts. Okay, I'm excited to turn to the conversation today, which I've been greatly looking forward to, and it's good to see Kate Starbird, and let me just introduce Kate briefly. Kate is an associate professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Kate's research is situated within human-computer interaction and the emerging field of crisis informatics, the study of how the social media and other information communication technologies are used during crisis events. Currently, her work focuses on the production and spread of online rumors, misinformation, and disinformation in the context of crisis events. Kate Starbird is a co-founder of the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, and I'm just thrilled to bring her back. Kate, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming to COVID Calls.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
So I'd like to start the way I usually do, just to find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic's looking like there today.
Yeah, I'm in Seattle. The pandemic today, I feel so distant from all the other people. It's hard, it's hard to really give a global sense of what's in a global sense, a citywide sense of what's going on, because I've been in my condo for so long. There's a little snow on the ground, which is weird for Seattle, so that's added some excitement to the day. In terms of COVID-19, numbers are down from a few weeks ago. We're feeling a little bit happy about that. Number of masks on people's faces is up, so that's good. Sometimes 2 on one face, but even more, at least 1 on everyone's face. So it seems like those parts are going pretty well. I would say tensions here are teachers are being asked to go back to school in some places and they haven't been vaccinated yet. And we're beginning to start to have stories of people that are jumping line on vaccines, and that's become some of the tension that I've perceived in sort of the local environment here. But for the most part, I think, people are just kind of settled in and hoping that things are about to get better, with a little bit of uncertainty about what might come next with the new strains of the virus.
Because I've had a chance to speak with you twice, I went back and looked. We talked on August 3rd, and at that time, the death toll in the United States was 154,992. It's a totally different era of this pandemic that we're in now. But one thing I was thinking about before we started talking, that was a moment of some optimism too, and maybe it was misplaced, but it was late summer, and the numbers were declining in lots of places. The election was still far enough out that it hadn't reached a sort of panic mode about that. And I thought there was some symmetry almost in this conversation now and then, as both times it seems like there's a little bit more hope, might be too strong, but lack of dread, maybe. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't realized that was when we chatted, but there are some similarities. I think right now the bigger hope, I mean, even in August, I think we were convinced, I mean, it's my partner and I, that it was still going to be a long time before things eased up and before we would be able to sort of see the people we want to see out in the world. But I think right now the hope is that the vaccines will be here sometime soon and they'll work. And there's also a little bit of uncertainty about that. So I think we're all still in that uncertain place where we're hopeful that things are going to get better and not totally sure that they will.
So you're so generous with your time with media. I feel like I have been able to keep up with you to a certain extent and reading, your quotes in NPR and Nature and everywhere else. But I wanted to be a little greedy with your time and dive into some of these issues a little more deeply, particularly after the election. And I want to start with that and think about that period of time from the election to the inauguration and what were you watching for in that period of time? Election day itself, maybe we'll talk about January 6th, I think, specifically, but I'm sort of curious how when election day happens, all of us are watching the big board and waiting for Steve Kornacki to do his thing. I get a sense you watch elections differently from other people.
Well, elections, maybe. My research has only recently intersected so sharply with elections. So this was definitely something different for our research team. I'm actually going to back up a little bit further than that. And I don't know when we talked in August, but about the 15th of August, a group from Stanford reached out to us and asked us to collaborate on a project called the Election Integrity Partnership to do rapid response to mis and disinformation around the election, not generally around the politics of the election, but very specifically around the procedures, around attempts to disenfranchise people, and also attempts to sow distrust in the election using false and misleading information. And so we actually, throughout August, September, October, into November, we're tracking in real time and doing analysis as fast as we could on different false and misleading claims, especially about false claims about voter fraud and eventually about election fraud. And so we've been watching that all along. And about a week before the election, we actually put out this paper and in this graphic about what to expect on election day, which was, in some ways borrowed from some of what we know about uncertainty in the disaster space. And that was that uncertainty creates conditions for misinformation, and also some other kinds of thoughts that we had of things we might see around the election based on some of the research we'd already been doing. And essentially what we said was on election day, we imagined that there were going to be a lot of people posting information about things that they thought might be going wrong with the election. And that in the aftermath of that, there would be uncertainty because the election had sort of been set up in ways with mail-in votes and different rules that many states wouldn't be able to count their votes on election night. And so there was going to be this period of uncertainty. And in that period of uncertainty, that we would be vulnerable to misinformation, and we would see people with political intentions assembling the evidence of all the videos and pictures of ballots that had Sharpies bleeding through, and people that thought they weren't able to observe at the right distance. And they would see all of this evidence wrapped together and tied into these already existing narratives of voter fraud that had been built up starting in the summer by Donald Trump and some of his campaign and surrogates. And so we expected sort of this uncertainty. We expected that there would be these false claims of voter fraud, and we also expected that after Election Day, as the counts came in, and because of how the counts were going to come in, there would be states that shifted from looking more red to looking more blue, and that there would be attempt to falsely claim that was an example of voter fraud. And sure enough, Election Day came, there was uncertainty. At first, it looked like it was going Trump's way, and things began to shift towards blue in certain places. We expected that he would prematurely call himself a victor, and he did. And so we saw a lot of the things that we expected. And then, after that, what we hadn't laid out was what was going to have to happen after. And we really did expect that to kind of resolve in the next few weeks. And what actually was surprising is and it shouldn't have been. I mean, we should know better, but that these false narratives really did take root. They became pretty hardcore conspiracy theories, and that they kept being spread. I guess we had hoped that certain media outlets would come clean with it and actually start trying to support democracy and not push these false claims that we thought would be really detrimental for democracy. And they continued to spread for weeks and months and into December and into January. And yeah, and that sort of it sets the stage of these false narratives, these grievance. They're motivating this feeling of grievance and eventually motivate much more. But they didn't start on election day. These things started back in June. We can look at tweets from Donald Trump that are saying, the election is going to be rigged and that it's going to be fraudulent. And sure enough, they he and some of his circuits set the stage for these narratives to continue to develop and spread and take root in a large portion of our population.
Even listening to you describe this, which I followed in minute detail, it feels like you're describing the election of 1948 or 1968 to me. It seems so distant to me in some ways because time got so compressed in those few days while that blue shift, so-called, was underway. That's a really critical moment there, as you describe, where misinformation can be injected into the system. I'm curious. I want to think a little bit more about that, but also, I remember that Election Integrity Project talking about some scenarios about what happens around the moment of the sort of the safe harbor when states send their electoral votes. And it made me realize yet again that the electoral system in the United States is impossibly complicated, so that even people of great goodwill and who are high information voters can still get a little tripped up and confused about what happens in those weeks after. So you said a second ago, you were even a little bit surprised that things didn't resolve in those weeks after the blue shift. Can you say a little bit more about that as we got into December? What was surprising you?
I guess what was surprising me is that people that perhaps we perceived as having the power to kind of stamp that out, whether they were in media or political leaders who could have said, we're not going to entertain this anymore. This is false. It's just not substantiated. Over and over again, the court cases are going in the other direction. And some folks did, but enough people were willing to kind of continue to play those narratives out, whether that's on Fox News or some of the other kinds of outlets, and allow President Trump to continue to deny the reality of the election, to continue to say that it was fraudulent and that he was robbed, and to continue to build that sense of grievance, which again, at one point they said it was going to be mail-in ballots, and then they said it was voting machines. It's the narrative kept changing. It's like a Russian disinformation campaign where they throw everything in the wall and wait for something to stick. But what didn't ever change was the meta narrative that he was going to be robbed and that he was robbed. And yet there's no evidence to show that. And it's so dangerous for a democratic society to start to not just undermine. We already have an undermined trust in information, but now we have an undermined trust in the election process itself. And I guess, I don't know why I was still naive enough to think, and some of our colleagues as well, that like by the end of November, our job would be done. By the end of November, we've tracked all this disinformation. We pointed out where it comes from. We said it was going to happen. It happened, and we're not the only ones doing this. There's tons of other folks doing this. And we just figured, at a certain point, the rational heads would prevail and say, let's actually try to do the right thing for the country and not continue to entertain this madness.
Well, I want to stay with that for a second because I had that same feeling, and I thought there was nothing that could surprise me anymore about 2020 as we go into 2021. But I was surprised too. I guess I was waiting, just sort of expecting that after the election results were called, that a shift to normalcy would occur. And I was struck, as you were, that mainstream leaders in the Republican Party and mainstream media figures who are attached to the Republican Party didn't coalesce around that. And I'm confused right now, and I want to sort of get your sense of this. I'm confused as to why they didn't, and I'm also confused as to why that matters so much. And maybe it shows my poor understanding of of how sort of people's opinions get formed. Like, why should it matter so much if the governor of Florida or the governor of Texas says something in support of an election result? We have the system, right? The system is supposed to work. It's supposed to be separate from these people who get in front of TV and say, well, I want to wait and see if all the results are in.
But the system relies on people within the system over and over again. There are people, there are electors, there are people that are showing up on January 6th to do these, like, you know, what was supposed to be a rubber stamp process, but it still required people to take these actions all along the way. And I think when those people become, you know, either believers in the conspiracy theories themselves or pushed by the people they think are their constituents who are now believers in the conspiracy theory, to take these actions that are detrimental. I mean, I guess we're beginning to realize how much of our democratic society relies on these norms of how things will work, and on, you know, rational actors and good faith actors along the way. And there's this piece here of that it really, you know, there are places where if enough people just don't do the right thing, the system can break.
I wanted to bring that back to the pandemic and see your thinking about this. And I've been wondering a lot if what happened in the days after the election, and then particularly January 6th, if those things would have happened in the absence of this pandemic, particularly with the disinformation that the pandemic enabled. Have you thought about the crossover point of those two phenomena?
That's one of the research questions we have right now as we shift back into COVID all the time instead of election all the time, is to look at the overlap and the structure of the spread of disinformation. So the underlying networks that are spreading disinformation, and compare sort of what we call we call them repeat offenders, but the repeat spreaders or influential spreaders of misinformation in those two contexts, and to see how much overlap there is. And I mean, just to step back and think about that, you've probably covered this, but if we remember the Plandemic video and how it spread all these conspiracy theories, it comes out in May, it begins to connect anti-vaccine communities with the QAnon communities, and then hyper-partisan right-wing media took that content and spread it out to sort of larger pro-Trump audiences. And these communities began to develop connections between them over time and become networked and more closely networked to spread mis and disinformation. So we had the Plandemic video, and then we had America's Frontline Doctors, this sort of group that was politically organized and was pushing misinformation about COVID-19, still is pushing misinformation about COVID-19. The producer of the Plandemic video was on the Capitol grounds on January 6th. One of America's Frontline Doctors, who's one of their faces, was arrested for being inside the Capitol building on January 6th. And so we have to think about the overlaps between, you know, the disinformation system around COVID-19 and how that sort of, it became it's politically motivated, but also there was opportunists within that who were gaining reputation by spreading these things, and how that sort of, you know, starts to develop these trajectories of mis and disinformation and begins to intersect with disinformation around election 2020, which eventually coalesced around these false narratives of election fraud and became a grievance-based motivation for what we saw on January 6th.
Do you think that I didn't realize that they were on the grounds, and as you described that, I felt a chill in the back of my neck, because it does make total sense. But I wonder about the receivers of this information. Do you think people were more vulnerable because of the pandemic? I mean, I think a lot about this information as a space in which bad actors move with intention, but I also wonder about people who are just out there receiving messages from various places in a Facebook group or Fox News or whatever. People were more vulnerable because of the fear they had of the pandemic, you think?
I mean, we talk about how uncertainty and anxiety set up conditions for the spread of rumors and misinformation. Certainly we've seen those dynamics. That's part of the social psychology of rumor, disaster sociology. We have talked about this for a long time. Like during crisis events, rumors are common, And there's been research on whether this is anxiety-based, whether it's about resolving uncertainty, how those things go together. And I don't know if there's a super clear causal story about that, but certainly we understand that under these conditions, that we are susceptible to rumoring and misinformation. We're also, increasingly online due to the pandemic, with very different social relations, because we're getting a lot of our sociality through online contact and less through in-person contact. And considering this sort of pervasive misinformation and pervasive disinformation and political polarization that already characterizes our information spaces, that's another piece of the conditions for us being vulnerable at this time. And so if we think about those things kind of working together, we can see the misinformation. Early on, it was just the false rumors and the fake cures and things, and those kind of burned out. But eventually it became more that conspiracy theorizing, where people began to buy into this disease isn't what the government's telling you. They're telling us to use masks, but then they used to tell us not to. They're lying to us. That kind of thought begins to take root and begin to become connected to these. Disinformation campaigns are great at leveraging organic conspiracy theories to serve their purposes. And another piece of this is, once you start to buy in to that kind of thinking, you become more vulnerable to more thinking like that, right? Once you buy into one conspiracy theory, you're more likely to believe another, and online, you're more likely to see another because of the way the recommendation systems work. So there's all these conditions that are coming together. And I do think, we had the socio-technical conditions with the pandemic and all this other stuff that was just really ripe for the spread of mis and disinformation, the spread of conspiracy theories, and the development of these just communities of conspiracy theorizing. We'll see. We'll look back and see, like, QAnon was there, but it was pretty small and just blossoms in early summer as it begins to intersect with this pandemic disinformation.
I'm really glad you brought up the sort of theorization that we have worked with. And a lot of that theorization is, that there's uncertainty in the system, and that requires expert risk communicators. We usually think of them as emergency managers or police chiefs or governors, elected officials who can stand up, or church leaders, can be other kinds of people who stand up and say, no, this is what's what, and you need to follow these following 3 steps. I'm not sure that the literature has made enough space yet for the kind of questions you're asking about what happens when there isn't closure for a significant percentage of the population around what that reality is, and to make it even more complicated, when one political party sees that as a route to electoral advantage. I'm not sure we have seen that in American history.
I might argue that both political parties probably saw that COVID-19 could be to their political advantage. One just by criticizing the current administration, and one by spreading conspiracy theories that somehow led the other way. I do think that there was something about politicizing the crisis that happened, and especially the mixed messages we were getting between Donald Trump and his administration and the non-political communicators who we would have been turning to. And so those mixed messages didn't help resolve uncertainty, they amplified it. And they gave folks that basis to start building those conspiracy theories, because they're getting those mixed messages, and they're hearing that Dr. Fauci, well, he's not a friend of Donald Trump in their minds, and so why do they have to believe him? And then they're more likely to believe these conspiracy theories, including the pandemic video, which were built around attacking Dr. Fauci. And there was both a political motive that was maybe perhaps drawing a large portion of people into those conspiracy theories, as well as more of just the uncertainty, the doubt, and the other kinds of things.
Reminding everybody I'm listening to Kate Starbird, as are you, on COVID calls and enjoying this conversation. I just want to stay with this 1 second more. I was going to ask you this later, but I want to bring it up now. Speculation, but the role of social media here. If Trump had been deplatformed earlier, I'm sort of thinking about this staging out where pandemic and misinformation, misunderstanding morphs into something a little bit more powerful and insidious. If he'd been deplatformed earlier, do you think we would have had the kind of results that we did in that period after the election up to January 6th? How important was that he was deplatformed, do you think?
Well, it was. It's so hard. It's so hard to measure in absence of all these other things, right? By the time he was deplatformed, we'd already had the insurrection, right? And the insurrection gives, you know, a lot of it changes the nature of the conversation, because we're no longer talking about, you know, harms that we can't see. We're talking about harms that we can see. So I'm not sure how we measure that, except by reflecting on our own lives and media consumption after he's taken out. Like, I know that the way that the things that I've seen and the conversations I participated in, and even the analyses that we've done, have changed because they've taken out this node in the system that was such a focus for so many of us for so long. I certainly kind of, it's difficult. Yes, had they removed the real Donald Trump account from the system earlier, that would have prevented mis and disinformation from spreading. Because if we look at the top spreaders of mis and disinformation about the election and even about the pandemic, he's among the top ones, right? He's among the top ones because his audience is so big and they're so cued into his content that whenever he tweets or shares anything, it was just getting amplified in these huge ways. And so certainly he's a super spreader of misinformation. The hard thing is, had he been taken out of the system before the vote, then his voters do have a pretty good gripe about you know, the system being balanced against him, right? And so I understand the platforms, you know, feeling like it would be tipping the scales too much to take him out of the system, even as most of us recognize that the way the platforms worked and the way he manipulated those platforms was part of how he gained so much power. And we're seeing that not just with Donald Trump, but with a lot of populist leaders around the world, just being able to use these platforms to generate, to motivate audiences and to capture a large number of supporters. But it's so hard to you know, I think hindsight's always going to be 2020. I do think it was probably the right move to take Donald Trump's account down after January 6th. I'm not sure if they could have done that earlier with the same amount of just everyone being like, actually, that wasn't such a bad idea. I think had they taken him out earlier, there would have been more complaints. And they were, I mean, if you look at what the platforms were doing, they were escalating the actions that they took that started last spring around the pandemic. They first put a label on one of Bolsonaro's tweets. Then they started labeling Donald Trump. Then they added a civic integrity policy and started labeling his stuff around the election as well. So they were escalating action, but yeah.
Let's talk about January 6th in some detail. I've watched it with my children, and I had this uncanny sense, as I'm sure many people did. I was watching it, and I felt a lot like September 11. I was seeing it with my eyes, but I was not comprehending what I was seeing, and also felt like I couldn't see what I wanted to see, which I reflected on that while it was happening. I thought, right now, I'm sort of a vessel for whatever kind of information you wanted to feed in. You know, if I had been wanting to go to QAnon or somewhere else to explain to me what I was seeing with my eyes, I'd have been a ripe target for that at that time. But I stuck with kind of mainstream sources and watched and waited. I've been dying to ask you this. I mean, what were you doing? First of all, I'm sure you were fielding a million questions, but what were you doing in those few hours, and how were you keeping track of the various streams of explanation that were coming out in those 4 hours?
I was trying to go about my day. We did an interview with a potential student at that time. I was sitting on my couch, which is across the room in that direction, watching a television back over here, and had my computer on my lap looking at social media, and I was sitting next to my wife, who was also watching. And I would say that the really strange thing was the difference between her reaction, which was just to sit there with her mouth open and crying and just like, I can't believe this is happening, to mine, which was just, there was a surrealness to it. And certainly like, I was horrified, but I just wasn't surprised. I was like, oh, that's the guy, you know, from the QAnon stuff that we see. Oh, that symbol means this. Oh, that, you know, the way that they're using that flag, that just, for me, it just looked like all of the profiles that, you know, we study a lot of different content, but when we look at the alt-right and the far-right content, what it looks like, just the visuals of what it looks like on social media, all these symbols and the hashtag patriot and all these things just come alive. That's what it just looked like to me. And it was this weird feeling of like, oh, now everyone else can see what I've been looking at for 5 years. And I don't mean it in this, and I know other researchers that have been looking at the same stuff felt that same thing as well. It's like, I'm horrified by it, and I wish this is not happening. But okay, now we should be on the same page here. Now we all should be on the same page. We can see that this is toxic and that something's happening here, and that it's real. It's not, there was a time where like, oh, those are just caricatures of people. They're not actual people. People are acting like their worst selves. That's not actually who they are. Those are just trolls. Those are foreign influencers. No, those are real American people who have now taken on those caricatures and become those caricatures of these political identities and are enacting them in violent ways that sort of tear at the foundations of our society.
It's amazing to me to hear you describe it in this way, and it really, to me, speaks to the incredible importance of your work, that you were watching and you saw the QAnon shaman guy who became a sort of instant meme. And I think and almost a source of humor in the midst of all of that madness. And we shouldn't have been laughing at that. I mean, you knew who he was. You had to.
Yeah, no, I was like, oh, I've seen him in images before. And I'm not even like a QAnon focused researcher. There are others who are just probably recognizing other faces as well in the crowd.
So the rest of us should have been able to recognize those faces. I mean, that might have been helpful, perhaps, in taking it more seriously and knowing that what was happening was not just, again, I think that this is something you must always struggle with. This is not some fringe phenomenon where a few people got together and got hyped up and decided to break a window at the Capitol building. This is a movement of people with a track record of actions in this disinformation space that brought it to life in person on January 6th.
This is actually a really hard one. I mean, I would say January 6th is a convergence of several movements at once. It's almost like the network graph. You've got the anti-vaccine activists and the QAnon folks and the pro-Trump folks, and they're coming together. And there also were militia elements that were organized who were within that. And
that's the Oath Keepers, right? Yeah,
the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the 3 Percenters, and they were they're all together, but they're not. Some of them are more sort of just convergent crowd, kind of providing cover for these more kind of intentional actors that were within that crowd. And I think we have to think about them in different ways. But if we look specifically at QAnon, which is something we all talk about, it's this conspiracy theory, very fringe, and it doesn't necessarily make sense for those that are outsiders. But people have been noticing that it was there for a long time, but it was quite marginal, and it was interesting and weird, but it was still quite small. And there was a lot of conversation among researchers and journalists of how and if we should cover QAnon. And if by covering QAnon, we were actually amplifying QAnon and giving it more visibility and helping to recruit for QAnon. And so a lot of journalists, I think, chose not to cover QAnon. There's a lot of conversations. People were criticized for covering it. And just hoping, I think, that it would go away. And I think we might revisit that, those recommendations that we gave each other and gave ourselves, because it didn't go away. And in fact, was just waiting for a couple of things to happen in society. Now, a pandemic happened, which I think did amplify QAnon and some other things as well. But it is an interesting story. Why didn't the rest of the world know about it? Well, the researchers knew about it. It's just, I was turning down requests to talk about QAnon for 6 or 8 months prior. I just, I didn't want to spend so much time talking about, that group. And I know others were kind of making similar decisions. And, I want to kind of hit myself on the hand, because we did the same thing with conspiracy theories in 2014 and 15. We chose not to focus on them and to focus on other things, just thinking that they were marginal and that we just didn't want to be involved in that. And instead those things festered, and eventually they became the focus of our research. We can't look away anymore, but we saw it earlier. We just chose to ignore it.
I feel 100% convicted that kind of work has now moved to the center of what we call disaster research. I don't think we can really treat anymore this idea that there's a disaster, which will then be comprehensible, explained by officials in power, accepted, and then move towards closure. I just think the model's not holding up anymore.
Yeah. And I don't even have a comment for that. For our research team, it just became, we started out just looking at social media disasters, and it just became a bigger and bigger part. First, the rumors of misinformation and the jokes and the hoaxes, and then, the conspiracy theories and where that connects to political objectives and how those two things play off of each other. And it's not just one. There's no we can't just pull out one little thread and here's the explanation for all this. There's multiple factors that are shaping these. They're resonating and shaping some of these things that we're seeing in ways that, it's sometimes hard to unwind. But certainly we're not going to tie it back. If we only could change this one thing, we only took Trump's account out of the thing, everything would be different. Right. That's not what's happening right now.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Kate Starbird today about disinformation and the pandemic and democracy in America. You can get your questions into YouTube live chat if you want to, or you can put them up on Twitter, and just be sure to tag at US of Disaster, and I'll try to get to those. I want to shift over and ask you a little bit more about some of the other things you're tracking in the pandemic, like the mask debate, for example, and the science and disputes around that. I know you're, like all of us, thinking a lot about temporality through this pandemic, things that you can study kind of in the moment, and things that we want to study with a little bit more purchase of time. As a historian, I like an even longer purchase of time, but I don't have that luxury right now. Talk to us about some of that mask work and how time and distance from the debate factors into the way you're asking these questions.
Yeah, these are almost two different questions for me. But I mean, one of the things we're trying to do is capture good data, because we think we're going to be studying this event for a long time. Both the event is going to keep going on for a long time, but for the pandemic, I think there's going to be a long period of time where we're reflecting back on this moment. And so we're trying to make sure we have data sets that are going to be usable for us and others to really ask a range of questions. We have a big team. We're working on a lot of things, but a lot of our team have chosen, several members of our team have chosen to work on specifically looking at different kinds of tensions in the online discourse. And this is separate from conspiracy theories, although it connects, but it's more, it's a different piece. We're one team, it's led by a PhD student, Andrew Beers, is looking at the anti-mask group and people that are supportive of masks, and how they are just conversing in online spaces. They're focused on Twitter because that data is public. And we have this idea that science is distrusted by those in the anti-mask group, and that the reason they don't believe in masks, or they don't want to wear masks, has to do with their rejection of science. And when we go look at the data, that's actually not what's going on. We actually see people on both sides of that argument, both sides of that debate, bringing science into the conversation. They're constantly citing different sources and saying, my source is better than your source. But what they're doing is bringing in different sources. They're bringing in different kinds of studies. They're bringing in old studies that said that masks don't really protect their wearers in certain kinds of, from the flu, in certain kinds of contexts. And in case, so it's really interesting to see the debates happening and kind of go not totally against our ideas of just sowing distrust in science. It's actually like very sort of, just the same old thing. We're all motivated reasoners. We're all trying to find evidence that supports our viewpoint rather than try to figure out what's actually going on. And so we're seeing people, leverage science in interesting ways. And because, you don't have to be a scientist to go grab information online and pick it up and use it and show other people how to use it without necessarily understanding the process of science and where different kinds of studies fit in and how we build consensus, but we also contest things. And so there's this really interesting thing it's about sort of science literacy. Mm-hmm. People still may value the credentials of science, but there's not necessarily the scientific literacy to have, even as they're having these very, they're pulling in these very complex arguments. but it's based on sort of logic and other things rather than kind of understanding what science is really about. So so that's a really interesting paper. We've also got other interesting things that we're looking at in relation to that same piece. It turns out to be really easy to scope a data set around masks. There's only one word for them. That's why it's actually easy to collect COVID data, right? There's only a certain amount of these words. So that's been one of the things that have shaped some of our choices of what to study first. But yeah, we have so many questions. We have a team of 6 or 7 different PhD students and advanced undergrads working on things, and lots of interesting questions.
That's really interesting because a lot of that kind of discussion we've heard. I sort of thinking about Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes' work about the climate denial, and there's a clearly interested party in fomenting denial of the science or reaching to alternative science, which is the American Petroleum Institute and the petrochemical industry. It's not so clear, to me at least, what the interested other party, the anti-Fauci, I don't know who the puppet master for that would be. There's no clear sort of industry that would profit by that I can point to. So I almost heard a little note of optimism in your voice there, that if it's a science literacy issue, that's something maybe we know how to deal with.
Well, I mean, I do think there's motivated reasoning happening, right? So people are approaching this not trying to understand what's going on, but to support their side. And I think their side here isn't defined by some company telling them what to believe. It's defined by these ideas of freedom, right? I should be able to say, no, this is the government imposing on me in a way I don't like, and I don't want the social distancing things, and I don't want the masks, and I don't want the vaccines. So apparently they don't want to take any kind of action to help them. And part of that is they pretend that the disease isn't necessarily as dangerous as it is, but they have this argument of this is the government trying to impose on me, and so therefore, and that motivates their reasoning to find evidence of why the masks actually don't work. But yeah, that's an interesting it's an interesting difference. I'm not sure that science literacy alone would help, would solve the problem, but it could contribute in some ways for those who actually might be persuadable, but the persuadable middle is smaller and smaller and smaller on some of these conversations.
Here we come back to sort of urgency, because I wonder, thinking about vaccine and ways to reduce vaccine hesitancy, it strikes me that this is another place where your work and the work of your center can intersect, because if you can spot misinformation and disinformation in the system, then that can somehow be actually leveraged almost in real time, I would think, by public health officials to say, hey, there's a rumor going around X, not there's rumors going around, but there's a rumor going around saying this, and this, and it's wrong on these points. Is that not possible at this time, or is that?
So we're actually, one of our higher level questions is, how do we develop the methods and the processes to do rapid response to mis and disinformation at a pace that can actually make a change to get to the information before it takes root. And we did that with the Election Integrity Partnership. We tried to do it. We had a multi-stakeholder collaboration and included academic researchers, government, journalists, civil society organizations, and some others. And we're trying to do the same thing right now for anti-vaccine content, or content that tries to sow distrust in vaccines. It's a challenging terrain, and we're also exhausted because we still haven't written the final report from the election one, and we're moving into the vaccine space. But and we're not the only ones doing this. There are other, First Draft is working on this to do some rapid response stuff. There are other research teams that are trying to do this as well. But I think we do think there's a real possibility for. It has to be collaborative. We have to be able to very quickly get those products of the analyses that are showing these, potentially false narratives, get them into the hands of people that can debunk them effectively, figure out what an effective debunking strategy is. We still don't know, but it would be great to test that rapidly. So we would need to be able to surface things quickly to even test these in some cases. And so we're working on some of that. I hope others are working on it too, but I do think There's some potential there, even as we're still learning about whether we should pre-bunk things, whether you have to just get to it fast after the first time they've seen it, and some other kinds of methods for intervention. I think still learning what those might be. Our group is more focused on let's analyze it, figure out how it's spreading, and get that to the people that can do the communication. But there's still some open questions in how best to communicate that.
That issue of the communicator again is opening up, from my mind, a million questions, because it's, in that instance, it's not going to be Tony Fauci. It's going to have to be some other kinds of intermediaries who have different networks of trust. I don't even know what thread to start pulling on that. In the disaster research after Katrina, one of the things that was really interesting was if that they show there's sort of low levels of trust among minority communities for good reason.
Yeah.
And that you had to look to different networks, and that it wasn't the Emergency Operations Center as much as we want to say, hey, what comes out of the EOC is the gospel about this disaster. We need to actually be looking to faith leaders or community leaders. But then that opens other questions, because asking them to put themselves in that line of command in the middle of a disaster, that has its own ethical repercussions. It seems to me almost impossibly complicated to find, once we step off of this idea that there are trusted officials giving us information, where do you go from there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard question. Another one I just don't think we know the answers to. And I've actually had some journalists query me about this recently, and got me to rethink some of the things. For the last few months, I think maybe a couple of years, we've heard misinformation is networked. Like the anti-vaccine community it has some influencers, but it's this network. People kind of rise in their voices, but they're in their mom groups or their particular kinds of chat rooms or wherever, and they're like other sort of conspiracy theory communities, and they're not exactly the same, but other conspiracy theory communities, they're insulated from authoritative voices because they've already convinced themselves that authoritative voices are lying to them. So if you think about this sort of, if misinformation, disinformation is networked, maybe to address it, it needs to be sort of this networked strategy, with more sort of people within the different communities, whether that is, whether that's within the Black community or the mom group, or Vietnamese speaking. Like, I think we can define community in so many different ways. But I do think there are some ideas out there about the best way would be to have find trusted communities trusted communicators within these different communities. But we don't know that works any better. And then it also relies on finding trusted community leaders who are willing to share these messages, who may not be. So it means connecting them to the process. And I think that's when we're thinking about multi-stakeholder collaborations. We really do need the people who are part of targeted communities need to be part of those collaborations to be able to help, both shape what the research into their community looks like, and also shape what the communication products to their communities are. And I think there's some open questions on the research side of like, what are the best ways to communicate about disaster response, disaster risk, and to help people make the decisions that are best for themselves and their families and their communities. And the things have changed. The internet has changed things. The loss of gatekeepers has changed things profoundly. And we may have to learn more about this new landscape in order to better design disaster communication.
We're almost up on time with Kate Starbird. I want to just give you, Kate, a second here at the end. Other work that's happening in your center, members of your team that are doing exciting things. I mean, you have so much going on. I don't know how you keep up with this pace. I'm a little worried about you, actually, how you're going to keep up with this pace, but I'm glad you're keeping that pace. Anything else you want to bring to our attention?
No, I think, with this virality project where we're looking at vaccine-related misinformation is something that's just getting off the ground with collaborators at Stanford and NYU and a couple other places. And we've talked about the mask work that we're doing. We're doing some structural analysis comparing influencers from the election and COVID-19. And we're going to do a lot of election-related research now that we have a little bit of chance to reflect on what just happened in our information space. So we got a lot of projects going. I'm sure I'm missing some as well. We have a big team, and fortunately, just a lot of really brilliant students and postdocs that that I get to work with, and they get to do all the heavy lifting on the writing right now while I do all of these appearances and do too much talking.
I hope that you're putting together a disinformation school or something where people like myself can go spend 2 weeks whenever we get sprung from this COVID trap and just immerse ourselves in that work. I really do feel like it's a gap for a lot of us, speak for myself, a gap in my own education about how I think about disaster that your work is helping to fill. I need more of that.
Like a disinformation summer school.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I hadn't thought of that, but maybe that's something. Well, we can chat about it. I'm going to be the director of the Center for Informed Public starting next year, and maybe that's one of the projects we could launch as during my 2-year drew the short straw work there. So
you heard it here first. I want to remind everybody that you're listening to COVID Calls. You can catch COVID Calls every weekday live at 5 p.m. And I want to thank Kate Starbird for her time today and for all of your work. And I hope that you get a break in the action at some point. I don't know what that looks like for you, but thanks for all you're doing right now.
Yeah, thank you, and for inviting me on. And I hope everyone just takes care and has a good weekend.
Stay healthy, everybody. We will see you on Monday, 5 o'clock.